we are going to begin our discussion of Chapter 13, which is Psychological Disorders. And so this first PowerPoint will actually go through pages 498 to page 506. So when we start talking about understanding psychological disorders, we start by talking about psychopathology. And that is essentially the scientific study of the origins, symptoms, and development of psychological disorders. Now, it's important to note that the division between what's considered normal behavior and what's considered abnormal is not always clear-cut or easily defined. So, for example, it might be considered completely normal to make sure that your doors are locked and your appliances are off as you leave the house. But if you start checking it 50 times before you can walk out the door, that would be viewed as abnormal. There's also cultural and social norms that play a role in all of this. So your book gives the example of an Indian woman who, if she were to eat meat, fish, onions, garlic, or any other hot foods within 6 months of her husband's death, that would be viewed as abnormal. However, in the United States, if a Christian woman ate those foods following the death of her husband, it wouldn't seem out of the ordinary at all. So next thing we're going to talk about is stigma, because there's a lot of stigma attached to suffering from a psychological disorder. And people with major mental illness are the most stigmatized group in modern society. They're usually portrayed in highly negative, stereotypical ways in popular media, things like in movie and TV shows, and even through social media. And these stereotypes get reinforced by non-fictional accounts, like news stories. So studies in the US and Canada actually showed that nearly half of the news articles about mental illness put it in the context of violence or criminality. Media portrayals are often exaggerated in regards to the behaviors of the mentally ill, and this can create an exaggerated fear of violence from those with a psychological disorder. And that's part of what creates the stigma. So now there is evidence that those with severe mental disorders, particularly those suffering from things like delusional ideas or hallucinations, they do display slightly higher levels of violence and illegal behavior than normal people do. But it's also important to know that those who are not suffering from those symptoms, even if they do have a severe mental disorder, are no more likely than the average person to be involved in violent or illegal behavior. The social stigma can also make people really reluctant to seek help from a mental health professional. And of course, when we use labels like crazy to describe someone with mental illness, it just adds to that negative stereotype. So your book had a whole section, Should Social Media Help to Diagnose Disorders? So there's some research. They're looking into how online behavior can correlate to mental health. So a few things they've picked up on. They've actually noticed there's a difference between photos posted by depressed people and non-depressed people on Instagram. People who are depressed are more likely to use that inkwell filter. They've also determined that those who search for things like how to commit suicide or painless suicides are statistically at a high risk for attempting suicide. Some researchers want to find a good way to identify those who could benefit from referrals or diagnosis and might be struggling with mental illness through social media. But there are ethical concerns. First of all, someone might be identified as having a psychological issue because of a false or an exaggerated posting the person makes. You also have to worry about privacy violations. And because social media is so widely used and produces so much data, researchers can actually see all the information and use it for something of value, but they still have to take a look at the ethics of it. So until ethics finds a way to make all this work right now, instead of using the algorithms that they used to use and the tools to help people who might be suicidal, Instagram and Facebook rely on the friends of people to post referrals as opposed to that computer algorithm. So now, what is a psychological disorder? Well, your book defines it as a pattern of behavior and psychological symptoms that causes significant personal distress, impairs the ability to function in one or more important areas of life, or both. The key thing is it's a departure from the prevailing social and cultural norms. So again, we're looking at what is the appropriate behavior for this particular person within these cultural and social norms, and are they meeting those or are they not? What kind of an impact does this behavior have on that person's ability to lead a life? So when we talk about psychological disorders, we talk about what's called the DSM-5, and it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, 5th edition. So this version of it, the 5th edition, was actually published by the American Psychological Association in 2013. And it describes more than 260 specific psychological disorders, plus numerous additional conditions. For example, it talks about child physical abuse and educational problems. And it gives a total of 541 diagnostic categories. And it goes through and it provides the codes, the symptoms, the criteria that must be met to make a diagnosis, frequency that has to be met, typical course of treatment, risk factors, a common language that all practitioners can use, and comprehensive guidelines for diagnosis. Now, it's important to note this is not written by a single person. It took a consensus of hundreds of mental health professionals, and the DSM-5 actually took 12 years to develop. So if we look at the history of the DSM, the very first edition was published in 1952. There were fewer than 100 disorders listed, and it didn't include disorders that we view as common today, like eating disorders, ADHD, or social anxiety disorder. But it did actually categorize some behavioral patterns as disorders. So one example, homosexuality was actually considered a mental disorder when the first DSM was published back in 1952. So the DSM-5, it has its critics and its criticisms. Some feel that it includes some conditions that are too normal to be considered disorders, such as extreme sadness due to bereavement. Some feel that it just uses arbitrary cutoffs to draw a line between people with and without a disorder, or even between diagnoses. And considering all symptoms of a disorder to be equal when some are more severe, for example, among people with depression, both sleep problems and loss of energy are considered to be core symptoms, but the loss of energy is more disruptive to the daily function. People also believe that a gender bias exists. And there's also possible biases related to financial ties between many of the DSM-5 authors and pharmaceutical companies who might benefit from the expansion of a mental illness category or the loosening of a criteria of a diagnosis. It also blurs the distinction between everyday normal unhappiness and mental illness due to a threshold that might be set too low. But despite all of its flaws, the DSM-5 is the most comprehensive and authoritative set of guidelines for the diagnosis of mental disorders. It allows for disorders to be standardized so that ideally a patient could see different clinicians and receive the same diagnosis each time. So some researchers have actually been studying the origin of psychological disorders and looking at it through the lens of biology. So one thing that's been identified is there are genetic risk factors. They've also identified what they call a P factor that incorporates a wide array of symptoms underlying in all forms of mental illness. So the P factor provides a measure of severity for the psychological disorder and relates to a cluster of risk factors, including a family history of mental illness, early neurological problems, such as perhaps language development issues. And although none of this is agreed upon, theorists do agree that there's a set of genre that's shared characteristics for people who have mental disorders. So now we're going to talk about how prevalent are psychological disorders. Well, they're actually far more prevalent than many people believe. So according to the National Comorbidity Survey Replication, the NCS-R, about 1 in 4 U.S. adults has experienced the symptoms of some type of psychological disorder at some point during the previous year. There's also a high degree of comorbidity. In other words, people that are diagnosed with one disorder are frequently diagnosed with additional disorders. In fact, about 46% of people with a mental illness have at least 2 mental illnesses at the same time. The rates of mental illness are high not just in the US, but also globally. If you look at the World Health Organization, they surveyed about 85,000 people in 17 countries from almost every continent, and on average, the lifetime rate of mental illness was found to be 1 in 3. So sometimes the treatment that gets provided is inadequate, and it falls short of where it should be. It falls short of the established guidelines. And there's a lot of issues that can cause a treatment to fall short. It could be a lack of insurance from the person receiving treatment. It could be perhaps their low income, or maybe they have a lack of access to mental health care. They might fail to seek treatment just due to a lack of awareness that they have a problem. They might fear stigmatization, or they might actually believe that treatment isn't going to help them. So Most people are actually able to weather psychological symptoms without becoming completely debilitated or needing professional intervention. And this could actually be due to the use of a variety of coping strategies, like we learned about when we talked about stress. So in the next PowerPoint, we're actually going to start discussing some of the more prevalent psychological disorders. We're actually going to go through and talk about some of the DSM categories and some of the disorders within the DSM.